It's the bird emergency, and it's another one of our live streaming power panels. This is a power panel. Look at who I've managed to assemble this time. Regular co-host, I think you've been elevated to now, Holly. Dr. Holly Parsons, Birdlife Australia, manager of Urban Birds programs, but I like to refer to the Birds in Backyards programs because it's just got a nice ring to it. Hi, Holly. Welcome aboard. Thanks for coming again.
Thanks for having me back again, Grant.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Holly, before we move to introduce our heavy hitter, you've got a new member on your team.
I do, and she's just there. Other way.
Just there. And she's also a previous guest when she was a PhD candidate at Deakin University studying beak and feather disease, but now a fully fledged Birdlife Australia member. Hi, Hannah. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's always good to get expertise surrounding the fool, so it's marvellous. And the heavy hitter I mentioned, Holly, Professor David Phalen from the University of Sydney. And David's got some special interest in lorikeets at the moment. Hi, David. Thanks for coming.
Hey, it's great to be on. Thanks for inviting me.
And let's start with the lorikeets, David, because that was what I was teasing. I had seen the publicity around the lorikeet paralysis disease, but you let me know in an email this morning that there's actually another one as well. So can you give us a rundown on what's being observed with lorikeets recently in Australia?
Sure. First of all, if you don't mind, I'd like to acknowledge that this research is being funded by a grant from Wires, and also that I've got a number of other collaborators, one, the Taronga Zoo, Carrie Rose, and Claude Lacasse at RSPCA in Brisbane has been really instrumental in us getting a lot of this work done. And I'm just one of many that have been actively involved in all of this. Our lorikeet paralysis syndrome, which is happening is a very specific disease that we see during the summer, during the warmer months, beginning in November, going into June, with a peak typically in December, January, and February in a very specific area of southern Queensland, southeastern Queensland, and northern New South Wales, northeastern New South Wales. And these poor birds come in, literally, as the name of the disease states, in a paralyzed state. They can't move their legs, they can't move their wings. In advanced conditions, they can't swallow, they can't blink, and all of them have very characteristic change in their voice. And we think the cause of this disease is that there's interference with the nerves that go to the skeletal muscles, the muscles that we can control, and that they are essentially paralyzed because of some sort of a toxin that's affecting them at that site. And we've done quite a bit of research and recently published a paper that shows that it's not caused by an infectious disease, that it's not caused by the common toxins that we would be thinking about that might cause this, and that the birds can recover from this. The most severely ones don't always, but the ones that are severe that we take good care of, and ones that are less severe have a good chance of recovery, but it can take up to over 100 days for them to get back to a point where they can be released back into the wild. And as anybody that's been sick in bed or had any disease, broken leg, or anything like that knows that once you're not able to move around very much and you're just laying around, all your muscles start to weaken and everything. And so these birds, we first have to get them back to the point where they can eat on their own and take care of themselves. But then we've got all this long-term debility, I guess you would say, that they have to recover from. And so it's like an Olympic athlete being put in a hospital bed for several weeks. Their muscles are going to shrink up and they need to get back into condition. It takes a long time for that to happen. And you can imagine that being in care for that long is a really huge stressor on wildlife carers and veterinarians, all because it takes an enormous amount of time and effort to care for those animals. And the RSPCA in Brisbane gets between 500 and 1,000 rainbow lorikeets every year with this disease. So it's an enormous strain on resource and a huge impact. So what we're trying to do is to find out what the cause is. And the way that we've done that so far is to test for a lot of toxins and to do our diagnostics and to look at some of the birds that have died under their tissues under the microscope. But what we're doing now is we're trying to identify what plants they might be feeding on that would have a toxin that might cause this. And so we have a citizen science project that's up and going, and it's on iNaturalist. And if you want to participate in this, if you're in that area of northern New South Wales and southern Queensland where this occurs, then you can get on to our webpage at the University of Sydney. Just type in lorikeet paralysis and University of Sydney, and that will give you all the directions on how you be part of this project. And what our goal is, hopefully by the end of this summer, is to have a short list of plants that we think might be causing this disease, and then we can investigate those plants for toxins and hopefully find out what it is. And if we can find out which plants are causing this problem, then we can create a situation where we encourage people not to plant those plants or to cover them up when they're fruiting or flowering. And so we can reduce the number of birds that have this disease. The second disease that you mentioned was very different, and it occurred on the south coast of New South Wales, beginning in probably January of last year and going through until the middle of winter or early winter. And these were lorikeets that were typically 100 kilometers on either side of Bateman's Bay along the coast, maybe even a little bit farther north than that. And they were coming into care, and they were very thin. They had diarrhea. If you fed them, the food wasn't going through them, and they typically died within a couple of days after coming into care. And what we were finding in these birds was that they had a very severe inflammation of their intestinal tract, and their intestinal tract was pretty much shut down. And we cultured a number of pathogenic bacteria out of these birds, but we're also a little bit suspicious that there might be a virus that infects them initially and causes their digestive tract to be damaged, and that the bacteria may come along as a secondary infection after that and ultimately kill them. And so we got onto that very quickly, and this relates back to what you're going to talk about today, Grant, is feeding, and is it right to be feeding birds? And the first thing that we thought, since this was an infectious disease, that we could do to try to control it was to encourage people to stop feeding birds, because these lorikeets would come in and they would be defecating in the area where they would be feeding, and there was an increased chance for a virus transmission or a bacterial transmission to occur at those feeders. And so that's the first thing we did, was encourage people to stop feeding, so that if it was an infectious disease, which it appeared to be, that they wouldn't be spreading it to other birds.
I'll link, of course, to your page, David, with lorikeet paralysis syndrome, and then people can register with iNaturalist, go through the links there and whatnot, and help out with wires. I've got a question about the paralysis syndrome first. Is it a large proportion, do you think, of each sort of small flock that might be feeding on whichever plant is the cause that are susceptible? Is it knocking out large groups that are all feeding together, or do you think it's more that there are small numbers of individuals within each feeding flock, feeding group, that are succumbing to the disease?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I can only speculate as far as my answer, but I can give you some evidence to support my speculations. We know, first of all, that there are some hot spots where it occurs. We did a lot of mapping and show that there are certain places where it's more likely to occur. We know that it's more likely to occur after it rains, which may mean that they switch food sources, that after it rains, the blossoms may not be particularly good. So it might have to do a little bit with the preference of what the birds are feeding on in the areas where they're feeding. It might be that some birds would prefer to feed on one thing versus another. Nature is never cut and dried, if you want to say that. And you give the same amount of a toxin to one bird and the same amount to another, and one might become sick and the other one might not. Typically, in one of the veterinarians that's been helping us out with this, he said that he would go out into his backyard where the lorikeets would roost, and he'd go up and challenge them, and several of them would fly away, and a couple of them would just drop to the ground and hop away. And so it's clear that in some groups anyway, that only a certain number are becoming affected, and whether it's because they're more likely to have eaten the plant that causes the toxin or they're more susceptible to it, I'm not sure.
Do you have your suspicions of whether it's I saw that you have a list of plants that have been noted as being prevalent in the areas where the lorikeets have had the paralysis disease. And it's a mixture of native and introduced species. But do you have a sense one way or the other of whether it's more likely to be an ornamental horticultural species or that this is something going a whack with the native plants?
Sure. So our hypothesis, our working hypothesis is that it's probably going to be an introduced species and that it's going to have a very limited range of southeast Queensland to northeast New South Wales. But that's the whole point of this study, is to try to get a better handle on it. There are literally hundreds of introduced and native plants that have toxins, and quite a few of those have the potential, at least, for inducing the signs that we're seeing in these lorikeets. I'm not going to bias myself. There are several plants that we've already identified that potentially could do this. But at the same time, those plants, many of them have been there for quite a while, and we see a lot of lorikeets feeding on them and not necessarily developing disease. And some of those plants will bloom during the time of the year when we don't see the disease. So what's going to be really important is over the next 4 or 5 months that we get observations on what the lorikeets are feeding on during the time of the year when this is a problem, and we can start getting people out to collect samples from those plants that we're suspicious of.
And of course, being the research being done by citizen scientists, the more the merrier, and the more the better the data to make any kind of interpretations or any kind of hypothesis. So if you're in that northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland corridor where it's affected, get hold of our naturalist, register and take some readings or some observations, make some observations.
We'd be really grateful to anybody who can do that. They can just look out their back window and see what the lorikeets are feeding on, or they can take a walk around the block or go down to the local green areas and observe a tree, take some pictures of the tree and upload it, and it'll be really helpful if they could do that for us.
Holly.
That's actually what I was going to say, was that not all of us are, well, I know, so I certainly am not going to be able to identify every single ornamental or native plant that I'm coming into contact with. So I think it was important to point out that that citizen scientists aren't being expected to ID the plants, but to snap a good photo to enable the experts to do the identification.
And we don't need to have the picture of the lorikeet in the picture. Just as long as you tell us that they were there, we'll believe you. And that'll be just...
David, before we have a chat with Hannah, I wonder, the rainbow lorikeet is often in mixed feeding flocks with other lorikeets. Now, any other species being affected by either of these diseases?
Yeah, so not really as far as the intestinal infection that we saw down along the coast, southeast New South Wales, this past summer and autumn. We do see occasionally scaly-breasted lorikeets that come in with lorikeet paralysis, but I would say probably less than 1% of the lorikeets that come in are scaly-breasted. Not so much that, and I guess I'm not trying to argue with you, but the rainbow lorikeets are a bit of an aggressive sort of a bird, and other lorikeets tend to stay away from a little bit. So I'm not sure how much mixture there is in the trees, but the rainbow lorikeets are the most abundant ones that we have, and they're the ones that are getting in most trouble.
They're certainly the bully boys of the Australian bush, no doubt about that.
And they have something to say about everything, I think, pretty much.
They do. Hannah, you spent, what was it, about 5 years looking at beak and feather disease. Have there been any development from the work that you told me about in, I think it was about episode 13 of the Bird Emergency?
I think I told you our main results. We talked about the main results last time. Since then, we've done a little study on the possibility of co-infection with beak and feather disease virus and chlamydia, especially chlamydia psittaci, which causes psittacosis, parrot disease, which is zoonotic and jump to humans, where we thought that it may be more likely than expected by chance to find co-infected birds because both pathogens, beak and feather disease virus and chlamydia psittaci, are thought to be immunosuppressant, so they suppress the immune system, which may make infections with other pathogens more like for the host, but we didn't find statistical evidence for that. And it may be that one or both of the pathogens may just not be as immunosuppressant as previously hypothesized by several researchers. But yeah, there's still lots more that could be done about studying that. It's always hard in wild birds, and because there are differences between populations as well. We did find quite a few co-infected birds, although the likelihood wasn't higher than expected by chance. Quite a few of our birds had both pathogens.
Holly, I wanted to get you all together because I think that the subject of to feed or not to feed wild birds pulls all these things together. Now, do you or does BirdLife have a view about whether people should be feeding wild birds?
So it's a topic that comes up a lot in the urban bird program and specifically through Birds in Backyards. We get asked that information a lot, and it's a really tricky issue. It sounds very cut and dry when you're talking about different conditions that birds can suffer, and beak and feather disease is simply awful. But the practice of feeding birds has been going on for decades. People continue to feed birds, even though all the official recommendations from state governments that don't feed birds. You should not feed birds, don't do it. Don't. Absolutely, there are all these downsides, but people still do it. There is still this huge proportion of the population that either regularly or semi-regularly take part in bird feeding. So I guess through the urban bird program, we try and give people information on what the risks are to feeding birds, which are primarily around disease transmission and also around malnutrition, so feeding the wrong foods and causing problems there, but recognising that people are going to do this anyway. So while we would rather you created a bird-friendly garden that's going to allow birds to forage naturally, recognising that there are people that do still do this and trying to give some guidance on how somewhat more responsibly and try and minimise that risk to wildlife. So we do have a few recommendations on for people, which is around keeping the platforms clean, which is around feeding appropriate foods for the types of birds that you are feeding, and also recognising when you have issues like a cockatoo infected with beak and feather disease that's coming to your feeder. Depending on where you are, most of the time birds don't need to be fed by us. That there is situations when there's been like a major catastrophic event, and we certainly saw that in the bushfires last year. There was feeding stations needed to be set out in those specific circumstances. But most of the time, despite how they may look at us, they don't actually need food from us. Birds are quite capable of foraging themselves. We don't have the really harsh conditions of Europe, for example, over winter where, those birds are reliant on people putting food out for them because there's nothing else around for them naturally. That's not the case in Australia, so they will not starve, and interestingly don't really become dependent on us. There is research that says that they will continue to forage naturally as well as take a little bit of food that you're providing for them as well. So there are ways to do it responsibly, but really considering whether it is in the best interest of the bird for you to be doing the feeding, I think is really important for individuals to consider. And then if you're in WA, it is actually illegal. It is illegal in WA to feed birds, and you can be fined.
Now, I'm putting myself out there on the chopping block today, Holly, and I have been feeding birds in my local park for the last few months. And actually, Hannah, I started doing it not long after we did our episode on beak and feather disease because I was so bored with lockdown. I couldn't go anywhere. And I'm speculating, but in the area where I live, we don't have a lot of groovy birds that turn up. But after the bushfires last year, we got inundated with corellas, longbills and little corellas. We have a resident group in the area of red-rump parrots. We have no rosellas. We have sulphur-crested cockatoos who have now moved in, and this is, again, I think because other parts of the state are not as conducive to them at the moment. And we've got some galahs that rove around and pay visits. Now, the park is a big grassy area. It's a triangle enclosed by three streets. It's very highly suburbanised, and most of the gardens around here, this sort of 1950s, 60s, a couple of fruit trees, a whole heap of paving, and maybe a bit of a lawn. So they're not really bird-friendly unless you're a sparrow or you're a ringneck turtle dove, spotted turtle dove, Indian ringneck, whatever you want to call it. Blackbirds, starlings. That's what we've got around here. But then these corellas started turning up. There's a lot of onion weed in this park. So they have been doing their bulldozer cultivation efforts and turning it over and arriving every day. And I was watching my neighbours who were getting interested in these birds that they hadn't seen before. But my neighbours, I have some of them who like to throw their noodles out in the park. I think I've mentioned this to you before, Holly, that some people go and throw whatever was left out from dinner in the park. But a lot of people just go and throw out bread. And, of course, the birds will eat it if it's there. So I thought, I like birds. I wouldn't mind interacting with them. They're coming here anyway. And my neighbours, and particularly the kids, are getting a real kick out of seeing all these birds that they don't normally see. So I started to get wild bird seed, the mix from the supermarket, and I cast it around the park in different spots, in different days. So they have to forage and they have to go looking for it and finding it. And I don't have any evidence of beak and feather disease amongst the birds that I'm feeding. So if I did, I would stop. And I think I'm encouraging fairly natural foraging behaviour. And I think I'm giving the birds a better option than eating the junk food, than getting the McDonald's, which has been chucked out there all the time. Now, hit me, Holly, or don't hit me.
No, look, I think, Grant, you've really touched on the positives that can come from bird feeding. And that's why I guess I sit on the fence a little bit on the issue, is that I'm well aware there are a whole heap of downsides to it for the birds, but in terms of engaging people and getting them interested in birds and feeling that connection, then bird feeding is one of the standout ways that people can do that. And you can see that because you've got kids that are interested. I guess it's about how we then take that a step further from just feed the birds to, okay, what should we now do in order to help them? So I can see both sides of the story, and I think the fact that you are spreading it around is probably, David and Hannah can probably clarify this, is maybe lowering the chances of transmission of disease a little bit at least, rather than having everybody congregate to the one feeding spot. So I can see some benefit there. I think as long as too it's not something that the birds become then expecting, because you can then get problems if you've got some of these more aggressive birds that are then expecting to be fed. They're not dependent on it, but they can chase away other birds that might be interested in coming in. So little red rumps, for example, wouldn't really stand much of a chance around a flock of corellas, certainly not against a flock of sulphur-crested cockatoos that are doing some feeding for sure. So I think...
sorry, Holly, I might clarify there that a couple of cockatoos that I think they're probably escapees who have joined this flock because they're really familiar with me. Now, they did, after a couple of weeks, start to come and sit on my fence. Birds are smart, so they knew which house I came in and out of, and they would come and they would hang out there. So when that happened, I stopped feeding for a while, or I walked around to the very far side of the park and put a little bit out there. So they'd become habituated to me. And I don't feed every day and I don't feed at the same time. So that they do have to come on a speculative journey to see what bounties are in the park, and then they can move back to where they come from. Now, most of them, I've identified a bunch of them that look like that are from a flock that hangs around the shopping centre where there's a big creek and reserve and whatnot there. But when they see me up there, they recognise me and they come and just see what I'm doing. Hannah, have you got any thoughts?
Maybe the main thought that comes to mind is we can't be sure that there's no beak and feather disease virus or no infection just because the birds don't show signs of disease, because there can be subclinical infections. I had, for example, some sulphur and other species. None of the birds that I included in my study actually were visibly sick, and still quite a few of them were infected, and the sulphur-crested cockatoos with really high viral loads, so lots of virus circulating in their blood. It may not necessarily mean that they shed the virus, why they are not very sick, so they may transmit it less. There's still lots of questions to be answered on that. But yeah, we can't be sure that the birds are healthy because they look healthy. So there may still be transmission going on.
Professor, what would you like to tell me?
It's such a complicated thing. It's really hard to even just start in one particular place or another. The places where we've seen a lot of problems have been where people, for instance, have fed mints to kookaburras and to magpies. and mince has no calcium in it, and they feed it to their chicks, and their chicks get very soft bones that break. And there are recipes and formulas if you're going to feed magpies or kookaburras or any of these carnivorous birds, then you should be only feeding things that have balanced calcium in them, and that can be dog food or that can be mince that's mixed with vitamins and other things to feed. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that putting out bread is definitely not a balanced diet. And we see that in all kinds of birds. We can see that in lorikeets and cockatoos. And we can see that especially in waterfowl. So people that have black swans that are feeding, or Pacific black ducks that are breeding on their local dams, feeding bread to them is just absolute worst thing that you can possibly do. I can remember being in New Zealand where we stopped at a lake the first time, my wife and I, and there's a call that the mother duck gives off when she's found some food, and then the ducklings come over and get it. She says she points it out, and then they come and eat it. And this duck, when she made that call, the ducklings ran up to us because they thought they're going to get food from us instead of going to where the natural food can be. So certainly feeding can alter some really important behaviors and get them eating the wrong thing. Seed is not a balanced diet. And if they were just eating seed and they were feeding it to their chicks, it's the same as if they were eating bread. It's not going to have any calcium in them. It's not going to have any vitamin A. I have a PhD student, Michelle Plant, who's up from around the Brisbane area originally, who's done quite a bit of work and is now finishing up her thesis. And we've got some really great data that shows that when you put seed out for birds, that they use that as one spot that they feed in, and they move around quite a bit, and that they'll come back to that area, then they'll move on to some others during the course of the day, and they'll come back and check that out in the morning sometimes. And if there's no food there, then they'll go somewhere else and feed on it, and they'll circle through. But what we're finding is that in these places where the food is always available, that some birds will use it less, but some birds will use it more, to the point where it might be the majority of what they eat. And so a consistent source of supplemental food that's not balanced, in some of these birds at least, will not be healthy for them and will make them, I don't know if it'll make them fully dependent on it, but we know that when all of a sudden that disappears, like at some of these commercial places during COVID, when they couldn't have people there anymore, that will have a negative impact on those birds, because they will be depending on that for a significant part of their diet, and all of a sudden it's gone. The disease thing comes and goes. Corellas are normally birds that feed on the ground, so they would have a greater chance of being exposed to bacteria that might be in the soil or might come from other different places. They feed in flocks normally, so if there's beak and feather there, then clearly they have the opportunity for passing that around. They're nomadic, so when the food disappears from one place, they're used to going to other places. I'm sure that the more food that's put out and the more concentrated it is, then the chances of disease transmission is higher. And so spreading it out like what you're doing and allowing them to feed more on a natural sort of a way, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I like that idea. And I don't see that's a major concern that's going to alter their behaviors. I think that when we feed them in a very concentrated area, that is the place that's the biggest concern for me. And we've seen outbreaks of disease in North America. We think that the decline of the house sparrow, which is an invasive species here, but is rare in UK now, where it used to be quite abundant, is because of salmonella that's been transmitted at feeding stations. Northern finches, siskins, and grosbeaks are massively on decline, and we think that's largely due to disease transmission at the feeding stations, problems with hygiene, concentrating animals in one spot. So it can be a problem, and while it might not be over many years in your backyard, new diseases can emerge all the time that can have major consequences, like the lorikeets we're seeing on the South Coast. So if you're going to do it, then you need to do it as carefully as you possibly can with sanitation. Move your bird feeders around. Don't allow the birds to concentrate in one area. Don't remember that most of the things that we put out for them to eat are not balanced diets. And if they're available to them all the time, then there is a certain portion of the population that can be negatively impacted, whereas not all of them will necessarily be. So it's a huge, complicated story. And I think the main thing is, if you don't need to do it, don't do it. If you really love doing it and you can't help yourself, then try to do it the best possible way.
David, can I ask you for some advice on a balanced diet? If I continue to be fairly judicious in where and how much I provide seed, what should I be also providing to increase the balance of the diet?
There's some commercial pellets that are out there that are a complete and balanced diet for most cetacine birds. And so I would think that if you might try to spread a little of those around, mixed in with the seed first to see whether they would go and eat it. And then if they are eating it, I might encourage you to use the balanced diet that's available commercially, because at least then when they're eating that, they're getting calcium and vitamin A and vitamin D and everything when they eat that. So I would try that out and see how that goes, and maybe you could let me know whether they like it or not. Or it could be like the cockatoo that comes to my veterinary student's window every day. He loves the sunflower seeds. They gave him a cucumber, and he was very quick to throw that off. They even gave him a crust of pizza, and he didn't care for that either. So you never know. They might not like what you offer them, but if you are going to offer them things, then you might want to try to offer them something that's more of a balanced diet. Other things you could try would be to put out some beans and peas that are more balanced. So some green peas, some sprouted soybeans, all those kinds of things. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were quite interested in those.
Yeah, I did notice, David, that somebody had put out some, what I suspect is guinea pellets, a couple of piles of pellets nearby where I've been feeding. The birds have not even looked at that. They've been out for about 3 or 4 days now, and they have not been tested at all. So I've got mung bean and those soup mix and things like that I've got in the pantry. But also I was thinking about whether a variety of nuts and things like pumpkin seeds and even occasionally some grapes or whatever fruit is in season. Is that a good idea to supplement with?
Yeah, different birds are going to feed on that differently. You can have rainbow lorikeets that'll come to put out fruit in your backyard. That'll come to feed on that. The fruit will go off pretty quickly. Anything that's not eaten, that's still around at night, what's going to come and feed? Mice and rats.
Yeah, I was going to get to that problem shortly. I might say too, I don't use any kind of receptacle because the lorikeets around here feed in the trees, and that's where I want them to stay feeding. I think there's enough of an issue with bully boy lorikeets than having them starting to congregate at a receptacle where the crested pigeons and everyone else will come in and having pigeon legs nipped off and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm quite happy for the lorikeets to just remain in the trees and do their own thing. The only ground feeding birds I want eating the seed that I put out are birds that feed on the ground. So
there are some seeds that have a little bit more of a balanced nutrition to them. You can look that up, but most of the seeds, but legumes and pulses, those would be the kinds of things that would have more protein in them, that would have more calcium in them, and would be the best. And if you sprouted them, that would make them even better. There can be some problems with sprouted seeds as well, so that's a little bit of a concern. But if you buy them from the grocery store and they're the same quality for human consumption, then shouldn't be any problem. Radish seeds, just all that sort of thing. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if, especially the Corellas, would be quite interested in those things. Now, it's again something that they might have to get used to, and it might be something they look at and say, I don't recognize that. Probably isn't as good as a sunflower seed. I'll spend my time looking for something else. But I think it's quite reasonable. Even the Corellas and the sulfur-crested cockatoo, they're opportunistic birds, and they're coming to you now because the food might be sparse in some of the places where they used to feed, but they move around. And they'll go in, they'll use up a food source, and then they'll go somewhere else. And so that's their natural behavior, and it's seasonal fruit, if you think about it. There's a certain time when stone fruits are great, and you go to the grocery store and get them. Right now, nectarines are great. There's certain times of the year where you'll have Corellas there. Certain times you won't, but that'll just make it more exciting when they come back.
That's exactly right. And my philosophy with feeding them with any of the birds is less is more, because I want them eating the natural food. There's not a great bounty of that around here without them causing problems where the neighbours will not like them attacking their trees. So I give them a different option. But look, the jury's out. Holly, we once mentioned I think when we were talking about the designing or creating a garden for birds, where you talked about junk food plants and a lot of these cultivars that copious in nectar and whatnot. We've also got that issue with a whole lot of fruit-bearing plants and nut plants and whatnot. So do you have a view, again, on what people should or shouldn't be planting when it comes to the one that's always, people are always trying to get gang cockatoos if they're within their range into their gardens, but they're feeding on hawthorns and cotoneasters and things like that. Should we really be promoting those as food sources?
No, that's right. It can be a slippery slope. Really, we need to, and I guess this can come down to a bigger discussion on scientific literacy and getting people to understand ecosystems and things. But birds are one part of an urban ecosystem or a natural ecosystem. But an urban environment is an ecosystem. It is a functional ecosystem. And so we want to make sure that what we're doing is balanced and that what we're doing is not going to have other predicted consequences. And so in the case of cotoneasters and things, of course, there is a negative consequence of spreading and weeds and things by planting those specifically for gangs. So similarly with feeding, if we're putting artificial foods out for birds, we want to make sure that we are not having a negative consequence down the line, whether that is with disease and malnutrition for the birds themselves, whether that is with our ability to get on with our neighbours, because all of a sudden we're feeding 50 self-aggressive cockatoos in our yard and they're decimating next door's fruit trees or eating their lovely cedar windowsills. That there can be those consequences for how the whole system then works. It makes it really tough for an individual to then make the decision on whether they're going to go forward and feed birds. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we need to learn to live together in a community, and that's the community amongst ourselves and the wildlife community as well. And we've seen some councils taking steps in terms of feeding around wetlands and lakes and things to try and counter the bred issue. Some councils are now suggesting some of the alternatives, so recognising that people are still going to come and try and give food to these birds, let's give them some alternatives of the peas and things that are going to be far less likely to have an impact on the whole ecosystem as continuing to throw loaves of bread in the water.
Yeah, I'm really mindful of the fact that cockatoos are horribly destructive, and I'm sure the little Corella, particularly if we were getting a big flock of them, but we're not. They're only occasional visitors. But the minute that the birds were becoming familiar with my place and were starting to land on the TV aerial and things like that, I just moved to feeding them at the far side of the park for a while, because I certainly don't want my neighbours having to put up with 35 screeching cockatoos at 5 a.m, 6 a.m, 7 a.m. in the morning. That'll be around here. I would not put it past people to be putting out baits to kill annoying birds. So all these things have got to be front of mind when you are creating, and they are new behaviours for the birds. That's got to be recognised, that even though they are foraging, and they're definitely doing a circuit each day, cruising around all their regular haunts for a feed. Some days they're going to get lucky at my place and it's going to be a bounty, and some days they're not, and that's how it should be. I don't feed small seed. I did start with small seed, but the sparrows and the pigeons we went from having a handful of them to having 75 crested pigeons, which they're going somewhere, they're parking somewhere, they're pooping somewhere. That's just not what I think my neighbours would want either.
Cresteds, though, are probably not going to be too much of an issue in sitting and in car parks and causing problems that way. I think it would be more likely the feral pigeons doing that. But I think the other consideration is the opposite end, and maybe David can clarify that some of the bigger seeds I think can be just as bad. So the whole sunflower seed issue is because they are so nutritionally, so energetically dense. They're basically a big chunk of energy for cockatoos and things, is actually not a great way to skew it either.
No, I know that they love the sunflower seed, but the mix I use does not have much. So they have to, if they want to keep coming back, they come back and they pick over what they didn't get the day before, and they have to eat the sorghum and whatever else is in there. I notice that everyone always leaves the wheat until there's nothing else, and then they all come back and eat the wheat. Yeah. David, do you have another thought?
I think when we talk about seed is a seed, and we don't really, there's no good one or bad one. They're all deficient in vitamin A. They're all relatively high in fat, but sunflower seeds are going to be higher than in fat. And our study where we've looked at king parrots and crimson rosellas clearly shows that they feed on the larger seeds first. And the reason for that would be several reasons, probably. First of all, every time they get a larger seed, they get more calories for bite than they do if they eat a smaller. The second thing is that they can fill up faster, and so there's less time exposed. And so I think those are the two main reasons why they target the larger seeds first. But the calorie density actually in the smaller seeds, the millets and things, is the same as in the bigger seeds. It's just they have to eat a whole bunch more of them to get the same amount of calories. But nutritionally, they're very similar. And they provide calories, they provide fat, they provide carbohydrates, but they don't provide balanced protein. They don't provide adequate vitamin A or calcium. And in an adult bird that's just eating for energy, it's not raising its young, that's not an issue. But if they're growing, if they're feeding young, if they feed on that continuously, if that's higher source all the time, then it will become a problem.
I look forward to updating you, David, and perhaps doing something similar again once I've got the pulses and the sprouted seeds and whatnot out there. And as we get into summer, once all the spring bounty in this part of the world has left the gardens, it'll be interesting to see whether more of the birds are coming looking for a handout. Now, I wanted to switch to watering birds as we come into the summer. What do we need to be mindful of with providing water? How should we do it? And my big concern with water is that people start providing it and then they go off on a holiday and the birds get used to a water source and then it's not there anymore. Holly.
I don't think providing water is quite as fraught as providing food. I think you can still have issues of disease transmission and the like in them, but not quite to the extent, I believe, I could be wrong, that you can have with feeding birds. And of course you don't have the nutritional tie in as well. I don't know of any research that shows that birds become dependent on an individual water source in a garden. I think certainly in drought conditions that may be a different story, but generally in urban areas at least there's going to be some sort of water source around that are accessible for birds. I think like food though, where you have your water source and what sort it is will greatly influence the types of birds that you get visiting your garden. A beautiful pedestal bath that you have dropped $200 on that is sitting out in the middle of a garden is going to provide some water and some bathing opportunities for the birds that are really quite comfortable as being out in the open, and your rainbow lorikeets, your magpies, cockies are going to love that. But if you want to help some of those common birds, and this is probably better than putting food out, because a lot of the time the food that we put out for birds is just satisfying those big aggressive guys that are doing really well anyway. A bird bath that is safely lower to the ground, provided you don't have cats and things in your yard, that is close to some vegetation that provides a bit of a perching things to be able to see approaching danger, is probably going to benefit things like your fairy wrens and your smaller honey eaters and the like a lot more than positioning out in the open.
Hannah, what should we bear in mind with disease transmission with providing water?
I'd say keeping the bird bath very clean would be essential. Again, it depends on which species you're getting into to have some water or a bath. It gets especially tricky from the beak and feather disease virus perspective. If you get parrots or cockatoos, the virus is transmitted by feather dust, by feces. So when that accumulates in the water or at the rim of the bird bath, that could be a source for transmission. And just scrubbing the bird bath down with a bit of fresh water may not do the trick, but just contaminate that part of the garden, because the virus is really quite stable outside the host and can only be killed by very certain disinfectants that are quite aggressive. Yeah, it's definitely a disease transmission risk having that, but there's also this huge benefit of providing water especially in the summer when it's very hot and dry. I think it's just a matter of doing it as cleanly as possible.
David, have you got anything you'd like to add about water or feeding before we wrap up?
Yeah, so about water, the first thing I would say is there's been a paper that just came out today that I'll forward to you that has some information about the possibility of disease transmission at the drinkers that they're putting out for wildlife, and that might be of interest to your audience. You could put a link to that. The thing that just came to my mind right now, and I think it sounds to me like a really good thing, would be just using a little sprinkler that you put on. It doesn't necessarily cover the whole yard or something, and you could tuck that in underneath the trees. You could move that around, and it's almost more like a natural sort of water source than, and there's no way that's going to become heavily contaminated with anything. And that they can go under there and they can get wet and stay cool. That's one of the key things. We're now having summer days that are hotter than any of our birds have ever experienced in their evolutionary history. And being able to cool off is really critical to them on the really hot summer days. So putting out a sprinkler that they could get water from, that they could cool off in, that they could take a bath in, and moving it around. And then you don't have to worry about the water bath that these concrete water baths, there's no way you can disinfect them adequately unless you bleach them, something like that. And even that's very difficult. And if you're like me, remembering to go out and bleach the water bath before you go to work, that's not going to happen. It just makes a lot more sense to use something a little bit more natural. And I think that they would enjoy that, and you'd probably attract a lot of birds to that and without a lot of negative consequences.
Sorry, Grant. I think similarly, following along that line too, we want to make sure if we've got a stand of water that it is being cleaned and emptied, because any sort of stagnant water is going to attract mosquitoes as well. And so we don't want to be breeding up mosquitoes in the garden and limiting your enjoyment, but also looking at transmission of diseases to humans as well. And we know, especially with feeding and potentially with bird baths too, I'm sure Hannah can talk to this about the potential of transmission of diseases to people.
Yeah, we'll go there in just a second, but David, I'm guessing that plastic, enamel pottery and things like that, and stainless steel are far better choices for a water receptacle if you do want to put one out than having concrete or any other semi-porous.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, and that's fantastic. And even better, you can take one of those and bring it in and run it through your dishwasher, and in your dishwasher, it will sterilize it. And you don't have to scrub it or anything else like that. And then you can have a couple that you rotate through outside and put some water out in those, and that would be a very hygienic way of doing that.
Hannah, is there anything that people can put in the water that can be a treatment to, like, I remember in cage bird history when I used to have an aviary when I was a kid, there was always talk of putting erythromycin in the water to keep your birds healthy. Is that just don't bother, don't do it, just good husbandry, clean it? Yeah.
Erythromycin is an antibiotic that wouldn't work against the virus, it's just a matter of cleaning. And the things that would work against BFDV, for example, are just too aggressive.
Oh, my God, I've just gone down the ivermectin path. Now, Hannah, I just want to get you to perhaps tell everyone what your role is at Birdlife now that you've moved over there. Before we wrap up, what will your job on the team be?
I'm now Birdlife's post-fire assessment coordinator, cryptic heathland birds, short and snappy title. So still vaguely parrot-related and a bit away from the disease topic. So I started back in January, and I'm responsible for post-black summer fire assessment of mainland ground parrot and eastern bristle, which are both species that live in our heathlands that are quite cryptic, hard to see. You mostly hear them if you're lucky. And those heathlands got heavily affected by the black summer fires across several states. And the birds weren't faring too well before that already. And now we just want to find out how they're doing after the fires, now that their habitat has been heavily affected. So where do they still occur? In what kind of habitat? And which areas do we need to protect as key areas for these birds?
That's really great, because I look at my whiteboard now for episode ideas, and I have bristle birds, but I don't have your name next to it. So I'll be reaching out to you to talk about the bristle birds, because for people in Victoria and with an interest in eastern Gippsland or whatnot, and bristle birds are something we're really worried about. David, is there some more information that if people want to follow up on the lorikeet diseases, the two that we've mentioned in particular, apart from the University of Sydney page, which I'm going to link to, are there any papers or anything you suggest that the particularly studious might want to follow up?
We've recently published our findings in the Australian Veterinary Journal, which is an online open access journal. And you can just type in lorikeet paralysis in Australian Veterinary Journal, and that will come up. And you can read through what our findings are. And if you've got some scientific background, and even if you don't, I think it's a fairly easy paper to read.
That will be great. I'll do that task and find a link so that it will be on the page on thebirdemergency.com so that it'll be easy to find. Holly, anything further you'd like to add?
Look, if people want some more information on feeding birds and the risks and how maybe to do it a little bit more responsibly, birdsinbackyards.net has got some info on to feed or not to feed that you can get a hold of. And I'll just also draw some attention to, I guess, one of the downsides from putting food out for birds is that you might get increased rats and mice around the place, particularly if you're leaving the food out. So firstly, make sure that you are cleaning up and you're not leaving food out for a huge amount of time. So we're not encouraging rats and mice, but also please don't use rodenticides. Don't put any baits out. You can find out some information on the latest campaign that we're doing on that issue on actforbirds.org/.
And yes, I certainly got your email about the petition, Holly.
Excellent.
And of course, we very recently did a forum similar to this on rodenticides, which you can find on thebirdemergency.com. Now, I'm going to open myself up to the audience for some criticism. I'll be putting a survey up on thebirdemergency.com, and it'll be really simple. Grant, stop it, yes or no? I'd really like to know what people think. I don't mind being the test case on this because the whole reason of posing the question is it is fraught with issues, and I'm not sure whether I'm doing the right thing. So I'm happy to be swayed. Professor David Phalen, thanks so much for being a first-timer on the Bird Emergency. Your expertise is greatly received. Thanks a lot.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Grant. It was great.
And do get involved if you are in northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland, in that study area for the lorikeet paralysis disease. And if you're down around Bateman's Bay, keep an eye out down there as well. Look for the links and get involved. And, of course, if you can support Wires, because they're the people who are having to treat the afflicted birds, there's a link direct from David's lorikeet page to Wires with the phone number. I'll also put in a link. Johanne Martens, Hannah, it's great to have you back. Thanks for coming along. Look forward to touching base with you, or what other cliche can I throw in there to talk about bristlebirds down the track. And Holly, as always, thanks for helping me along with this, and we'll be doing something again in the near future, I think. I've got water in the landscape penciled in. Hopefully we'll have our rock star personality to talk about water. And then we've still got to talk about planning and the urban environments. And actually, something else to me, and I want to ask all of you a really simple question. And David, because you are on special interest in koala health, let's use koalas as an example. Who owns koalas? Like, who owns wildlife?
They belong to all of us through the government. They're protected by the government. You can't do anything to them without permission from the government. So technically, they're owned by the federal Australian government, and they're under the protection of the Australian government.
Now, I understand the protection and whatnot, but if an icon species like the koala is worth countless dollars to Australia in tourism, or it was pre-pandemic, and there are businesses all over the country that rely on people nursing koalas and taking photos with koalas. So if the government owns the koalas, why don't they appear as a line item in our national accounts?
It's an interesting question. I always think of this in terms of hunters, and you're going to think that's a very strange sort of analogy. But if you want to hunt in Australia or you want to hunt in North America, you have to pay a license fee, and you have to pay a significant amount of money to the government to be able to take an animal to shoot it. And the money that they take goes back in part to regulate the hunting, but it also goes back to the conservation of the species that they're working with. So in North America, there's a group called Ducks Unlimited, and their whole focus is buying habitat that ducks use for in the winter and also where they breed in the summer. And they're very much a conservation organization. And while their members enjoy hunting ducks or just watching them even, their members pay to try to maintain the animals and to make sure that there's a future for them. Bird watchers don't pay anything. I want to go out and watch birds in my backyard or go down to the street or go down to the national park, except unless I have to pay to get into the park, I don't pay anything. And I reap all the benefits of having them there, but I don't contribute to their conservation. In fact, I may, by driving there, be contributing to global warming. So I think that from a financial point of view and trying to maintain them, that a very small tax, one way or the other, on products that are sold that bird watchers use or people use or that people use the different forests or whatever, and taking that money and putting that back into the conservation of the species that we value so much, I think it would be a really good idea.
Holly, I saw your wry grin when I mentioned this whole issue. We're going to go down this path sometime soon. So just keep that in mind. I'm astonished that we, in this day and age, when we're talking about how valuable the tourist industry, that we have not yet connected the dots between the tourism dollar and the value of the wildlife, the value of the habitat, and that there hasn't been a lot of work, certainly not that I'm aware of, about valuing it in our national accounts. So look forward to that, everyone. Off the track from feeding birds. But hey, we're all about protection here. We're all about protection. Thanks, everyone, for being part of the panel, and we'll do it again soon. Of course, this is going to be up on the Bird Emergency website and in the podcast feed sometime shortly. And I know some people were watching us live, but for those who didn't, we'll be rebroadcasting it over the next week or two. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Grant.
Bye.